All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030, New York's webinar. My name is Cam Hotto. I'm a junior at the University of Buffalo and the Vice Chair of Sustainability for the SUNY Student Assembly. Tonight, we have some great panelists and great breakout room discussions for you as to how students across New York State can take action to tackle one of our planet's biggest challenges, which is climate change. Solve Climate by 2030 is an event that will be in over 50, or will be in 50 states, 35 countries, and with over 100,000 participants participating. We have a national video created by Bard College, and we will share that with you now.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 U.S. states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eben Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the two hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon-neutral economy, while the U.S. rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinar's homework for the students and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forward, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, Global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
Powerful words from Dr. Goodstein there. Appreciate you for sharing that with us. I'd like to introduce our panel of climate leaders from across New York State, spanning different industries as well, which I think is very great to have different perspectives. First, we have Jodi Smits Anderson. She's the Director of Sustainability Programs for the Dormitory of the State of New York. Jodi seeks to understand and expand our carbon literacy through improved communication, education, and advocacy about vital greenhouse gas reduction goals. She's an architect, past regional and national U.S. Green Building Council committee member, as well as a wife, mom, hiker, kayaker, knitter, and storyteller. She has spoken at conferences throughout the United States, including several times each at Green Build, the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association's Building Energy Boston, and the New York State Green Building Conference. And she's also been a guest teacher at ESF, RPI, Ithaca College, New York University, Cornell, and SUNY Albany. Jodi, thanks for joining us. Second, we have Sarah Salati. She's the Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer for the New York Power Authority. She's responsible for managing the wholesale and retail commercial operations, including oversight of $2 billion in annual revenues from New York Power Authority's power generating assets through wholesale energy trading and contracting. She's also the executive sponsor of the Women in Power Employee Resource Group. She seeks to advance the New York Power Authority's vision of a thriving, resilient New York State powered by clean energy by driving strong commercial, operational, and technologically agile perspectives. Sarah, thanks for coming. Last but not least, we have Simeon Bannister. He's the Vice President of Community Programs for the Rochester Area Community Foundation, a community that hits close to home. It's my hometown. At the Community Foundation, he's responsible for managing the Community Programs Department, which is responsible for the foundation's grant making and community leadership. His career spans across the public and private sectors, having worked for organizations including the New York State Senate, the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance, the State University of New York, and several private commercial real estate firms. Simeon, thanks for joining us as well. Tonight, we have 3 questions for our panelists. We'll dive in a round robin style. Jodi, I'll ask you the first one. In your eyes, what does a green recovery look like for us post-COVID? How can New York State develop in a sustainable way?
Oh, not an easy question to kick us off, right? That's a really weighty question, and the answer is actually, I think, to find the joy in the process. And what I mean by that is really using this moment of what is chaos and uncertainty to connect with people that we wouldn't connect with if everything were safe and normal, because we'd be stuck in our own paths doing our own thing. Now's the opportunity to really engage with people across the silos of businesses, across the silos of communities, across our learning from our past curricula, and work together for the solutions. It is amazing how much I learn on a daily basis when I go outside my own comfort zone. So my vision is something that is much more exciting than what has been for the last 20 years, but exciting in a positive way as opposed to a panic way, which I think we've had enough panic. I think that we could embrace the excitement of innovation again in a way that we haven't in quite some time.
Very interesting points. Sarah, what are your thoughts on developing a green recovery for the state of New York?
Well, I think New York's a great state to live in. I'm not originally from New York. I grew up in Pennsylvania, but it's a contiguous state. And I did work in Manhattan for 6 years out of college. So I like to say that I'm a returning New Yorker. But really, New York is a leader in the nation and the world when it comes to the clean energy agenda. It's quite interesting to see that now the harmonization potential between New York and state legislation with federal activity as well. But the things that I think about from a policy perspective and legislative perspective is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that was passed, right? It wasn't a governor's executive order. It came right through the legislature and it was voted on. And you could even see the budget bill that passed, how many billions of dollars are being put towards a cleaner energy agenda. But in the context of the past legislation, we have 9 gigawatts of offshore wind that we want to install off of our coasts. We have 3 gigawatts of energy storage, 6 gigawatts of distributed energy resources. We want to get to 70% renewable energy by 2030, and by 2040, 100% carbon neutral. And that means investment. That means investment in renewable technologies to support us on the supply side. It means investment on the load side or the demand side when it comes to energy efficiency and electrification, right, to support the clean energy. And then transmission, which is also a big area, but the amount of infrastructure and steel in the ground that's needed supports a huge number of jobs when it comes to the state of New York, and it provides opportunities, going back to what Jodi was saying, for innovation and incubation of new business models, of new technologies. And so to me, there's a wealth of opportunity when it comes to building back better, as we're saying, and it really is in the transformation of the energy sector.
Yeah, and it's great to see New York State taking that lead on transitioning to renewables. Simeon, your thoughts on developing a green recovery for the state of New York?
Okay, first, thanks for having me, and I feel really honored to be on this panel with Jodi and Sarah, who, at least in my quick Google stalk, proved to be really wonderful experts that really bring a lot to the table. What I would simply offer is that what I see is the kind of historical legacy that has led us to the point that we are now is fundamentally an extractive economy. An extractive economy that is not only taken from the land in the form of fossil fuels and extracted good, clean water, but it's also extracted human labor. And frankly, when we look at our society, and when I look specifically at the community that I live in here in Rochester, New York, what we see is that so much of that extraction when it comes to people has been largely racialized. And so it feels to me like if we're going to have a green recovery, and I really love what the Clcpa does, but that we have to start by centering people. That's where we have to start. So it's not even a question of just how we can reduce emissions, but if we know that there's a historical legacy that some folks have borne the burden, then the question isn't just about reducing emissions, it's how do we do it for the folks that have suffered the most? Why is that important? Well, it's not just a moral imperative. It's also critical because I can show you educational statistics, I can show you criminal justice statistics, I can show you a map of Rochester from the 1930s that was redlined. And that same map shows you every single statistic that I just shared. It's critical because those maps and those statistics tell us a story about how we're able to solve problems or not. Can't get the graduation rate to budge, right? Can't get the crime statistics to go down. And we're gonna layer on top of that, if we're not careful, can't achieve our climate goals. If we start with the folks that are the most vulnerable, if we center them, if that's our point of departure, then that gives us the chance to really make something that is sustainable in nature.
I just would like to add to that because again, it's something that is in the climate, and I agree with Simeon, it is something that's in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act to focus on historically disadvantaged communities and environmental justice communities. And that is something that actually excites me too about NYPA's new Vision 2030 strategy is that we are very focused on that. We have power plants that are in urban areas that are supporting the reliability of the system in the southeast New York, Manhattan, Long Island. But we're partnering with environmental justice groups to identify ways for us to transition over the next decade from fossil fuels, from our gas assets, and to ensure that we're incorporating technology and we're taking a holistic view, exactly to what Simeon was saying, around what are the fundamental outcomes and what are the holistic benefits, right? Because it's not just about, it's the triple bottom line, as you would say, right, when it comes to sustainability.
Yeah, and if I could add a little bit to that as well, I think you've made some incredible points, Simeon, and it ties in with building on the excitement and engaging the people. I think what we have in front of us is a lot of history of short-term decisions that haven't taken into account all of the potential co-benefits or co-burdens. So we've made decisions based on the view of one type of person or one type of economy or one type of place and one type of technology. We haven't said, how does this affect the systems that are impacting this particular building or this particular education platform or this particular policy? And then we haven't taken it to the next step and said, how is this affecting nature's systems that feed the mix? This is a regenerative practice mentality. If we can actually create our projects and our ideas to benefit the systems and to benefit nature to the point where nature is better at supporting those systems and then nature is better at supporting us, we've got a reciprocity that's incredibly powerful. And that means that we're paying attention to the systems we're in as opposed to trying to conquer them. Conquer has never worked. And you mentioned that labor and people have been cheapened. I recommend a book called A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. It's a phenomenal read. So if you get a chance to check that out, it makes that case incredibly well.
Great perspectives all around. That's really insightful. Moving on to question 2, Jodi, we'll go back to you if you don't mind. What's the one most impactful action we can do to address climate change, as individuals and solve climate by 2030?
Yeah, see, I'm a big advocate for fighting against the one big thing kind of mentality. Nothing personal. The question actually gives me a chance to say that, so I welcome the question. There are a million things that need to be done by millions of different people, depending on their ability and their access points and their curiosity. I would say the one enabling thing that would be very important to cultivate in all of our cultures is to stop making mistakes a bad thing or lessons learned a bad thing. We should, if we could just scour the embarrassment out of goofs, we will actually make much more progress much faster. We need to embrace people who are willing to say, look, I did this project and I thought it was going to work this way and it totally didn't. And it worked this way. And what I learned is what not to do next time. And I'm telling you what not to do next time. And right now, and I have to say this with a little trepidation, government is also still a little nervous about saying we tried something and it goofed, but government has the capability to truly be leaders and reach out for some of those potential mistakes, but potential successes. And so I'll retract the first statement. If there's one thing that would make a big difference, it's embracing the continual learning mentality and embracing risk as part of the process.
I like that answer a lot. Sarah, on to you. The one most impactful thing we can do.
Well, I was I agree with Jodi on both fronts, because my answer too is that it's billions of things, right? We're all individuals in this cosmos, right? And so it takes the action of all of us, right? And on a daily basis, right? And bringing our own talents to bear in terms of supporting, combating climate change. And I think it's a very interesting comment that Jodi made too. All of us are trying, NYPA included, private sector, everyone wants to be a learning organization, to fail fast, right? To take from that and accept it. It's easier said than done. So again, I think the positive and, the learning mind, right? And the open mind towards that, right? And taking risks where you're not betting the entire farm, right? But you can learn is important. So I would agree with that. I mean, going back fundamentally to what I think, outside of the fact that everybody has a role to play, I think a lot about technology learning curves. And with every doubling of capacity, you typically see a reduction in cost of 18 to 20%. So when I think about what's going to get us to the next, to the most cost-effective, clean future, it's about bringing those cost curves down across a full range of technologies as quickly as possible. And that's where then fundamentally, now that I work in the government, I see the role that policy can play, right? Policy can play, it can provide incentives, it can provide subsidies to help accelerate that learning curve and the economies of scale and the learnings that we fundamentally have to, going back to what Jodi had to say, that we have to have in order to be able to then get the technologies to a commercial and economic level, so that people are making those decisions just with their own pocketbooks. So that would be the one thing I would say is going to be helpful.
Very great to hear. Simeon, your take on the one most impactful action.
Yeah, so there's a great piece of work by a firm called FSG. The title of the piece of work is called The Waters of Systems Change. And let's be clear that this is a systems change challenge that we're certainly confronting. What they offer in this piece of work is that they say that there are levels to this, as some of the young folks might say. There's the explicit, the semi-explicit, and what they call the transformative. On the semi-explicit, the explicit rather, there's policies, there are practices, laws, resource flows, the things that we can really kind of see, wrap our heads around. They would argue that on the semi-explicit, kind of a little bit more obscured, are some of the power dynamics, some of the relationships and connections, the meeting before the meeting and the meeting after the meeting, where some of the decisions get made, the pre-existing relationships. But they would say on that transformative level is where you find what they describe as mental models. Jodi said something earlier that really, it's a term that captures my attention. I hope it captures yours. She talked about regenerative economies. We have had and because I'm talking to college students, somebody in here is in a philosophy class right now. And if you are, perhaps you are engaging the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who said that our goal is to do the greatest good for the greatest number. And on its face, that sounds like a reasonable goal, doesn't it? Except that it's predetermined scarcity. It presupposes that we have to start from the position of scarcity. There's only so much to go around. And so if we're doing the greatest good for the greatest number, that means that somebody's gotta lose. And we know that historically, the way that you lose in our society, frankly, has been being a person of color. And so we can change that mental model, that instead of scarcity, instead of we don't have enough, how do we do the greatest good for the greatest number? We have to extract. Greed is good. That we can have a regenerative economy. And in some ways that draws on historical traditions, certainly out of African cultures, out of First People cultures. It draws on historical traditions that say, let's figure out how we live in balance and harmony. And that's the exciting thing to me, that we are actually in the technological position to have a conversation about regenerative economy, that we can draw on solar power. And if we can get those panels just a little bit more efficient from about 30 to 35% where they are today up to 50, 55%, that it is cheaper for you to make your own energy at your own home than for the power company to ship it to you. That is a game changer. And if we can make sure that that cost curve is low enough that everybody can participate, if we start with those that have been historically excluded, boy, are we onto something. So this gets me excited. I hope it does get you excited too, because it means that we can finally have the conversations about how we do things differently. And that, to me, is what systems change is all about.
I can tell you, I'm excited. That all sounds great to me. I'm all about renewable energy, so I love it. Moving on to our third question.
You know, going back to what Simeon's saying, that's one of the benefits of technology, right? The fact that you can leap forward, right? It used to be that you needed landlines so that everyone could get a phone, right? But then you can, in the developing world, put up a cell tower and then everybody can get a cell phone, right? Which wouldn't have been possible before. It's very much the same when it comes to specifically what Simeon said with solar panels, right? You know, developing world wasn't able to, you know, didn't have the funds necessarily in some economies to build a massive plant, even if you had coal or other extractive, you know, fuels that in your country, right? But again, you've got plenty of sun and the desertification of much of the world, and so there again, you know, it enables people and lifts lives. So it kind of goes back again to Jodi's comment about embracing the innovation and the challenge from a very positive and multiplicative way than a scarce way, like Simeon was saying. No, I think it was very well put.
Can I add something that might be a little bit provocative, I guess, to the conversation? I think that one of the things that is potentially, all right, how do I say this gracefully? We focus a lot on technology solutions, but I think the core of the problem, and Simeon, you touched on this, is certainly relationship-based and respect-based. And we definitely need renewable energy. There is no doubt in that. We also need to understand our relationship to consuming, to toxins, to the us them mentality of I want, therefore I have, and if someone else doesn't get, then hoorah for me. That kind of stuff, that lack of respect for not just humanity, but for every single aspect of the natural systems of the world, that lack of respect for flowers and bunnies and birds behind me and my cat, the lack of respect for all of that stuff, if that continues, no matter how good the technology, we're not going to solve the climate crisis.
Can I just pick up on, because since Jodi's being provocative, I want to be a little bit provocative myself, and just point out that I think that that's exactly right. Here's how we know that it's right. We know that the technology, right, because technology is not something that exists in the abstract, right? That the technology for electric vehicles has been around for 100 years. We know that the first cars were actually what? Electric vehicles. So at the end of the day, it wasn't a question of technology. We also know that John Rockefeller and the power regime at Standard Oil connected with, worked, manipulated in some ways, our systems to create this addiction to the internal combustion engine and the suburbanization of America, which, by the way, was done in ways that was predicated through redlining and restrictive covenants on the backs of people of color who then could not live in those communities, who could not participate, and who became grist for the mill. So you're absolutely right, Jodi, that we've got to be thoughtful, not only about just the technology, but we've got to have the shift in the mental models, which then translates ideally into shifting power relationships that gives all of us, and at least the tradition I live in, a more robust democratic approach.
Very, very great insights. Moving on to our third question here, specific to students, we'll go back to Jodi here as well. Jodi, what can students do to facilitate, some of those actions that you've referred to? How can they take the lead to tackle climate change?
Yeah, wow. I think that I often go back to language and understanding language and seeking to communicate better. I have a lot more to learn, and I'm learning every day. I constantly make mistakes, but I hope that I don't make the same mistakes over and over. And what I mean by language, it's not just identifying poor language, but cultivating your own better language. An example of poor language, which ties into the whole fossil fuel industry, the biggest, best, most pervasive example of greenwashing is the term natural gas. So I'm not allowing anyone to use that term anymore in my presence. It really is ridiculous that we would call that natural gas when we have to process it to some level and ship it and use it, and it emits carbon that's a real burden to the systems of the planet. But it was a great greenwashing strategy that nobody questions. Nobody questions it. That's one example of a big terminology that's frustrating. A little language thing that has to be done by every single person. I actually learned it when I did improvisational theater, and it's used in good corporate practice as well, and it's yes and. So when somebody brings up anything, even if you don't agree, if you do agree, the nature of us of late is to, like, I don't know, say Cam, you make a suggestion that maybe we should ride our bikes 30 miles to go see a play. And I'm thinking, oh my God, it's, we're going to go to the play and we're going to ride home. I can do the 30 miles, but we're going to be riding home in the dark. So normally I would say, no, we can't do that. We're going to have to find an Uber, or we're going to have to find someone to bring us there. Instead, if I said yes, and we have to figure out how we can get home safely from that play, then that changes the entire nature of the conversation to working with the existing situation and trying to build upon that existing situation. I think too often, it probably happens in your classes as well, anyone who's listening to this, too often we are given a problem or we are given a situation. I'm an architect, so design teams do this all the time. Oh no, we can't do that. We have a restricted budget. Okay, yes, we can do that, but we have to figure out in what other area of the budget we can be a little smarter so that we have the money to do that thing you're talking about. It's working with the priorities and building together the solutions. So language is a big deal. And I think that language has been more evident in the last 3 to 6 years, with everyone starting to pay attention to preferred pronouns. I think we're starting to learn to acknowledge the lands that we live on as being part of tribal lands that we have ripped away from them. So those acknowledgements are valuable language. I think that if we could each focus on our language and build respect into our language and curiosity into our language, we could get a lot further, a lot faster. And I'm an architect, so I get technology, I get building systems, I get budgets for projects, I get all that. But for me, I firmly believe that you have to start from the communication. So build your communication skills. There you go. And be curious. 2 things, sorry.
No, very great. I like it a lot. And of course, back to your main point of embracing continuous learning throughout your education. Sarah, your thoughts on actions students can take to facilitate goals towards tackling climate change?
It goes a little bit back to the prior question, right? In my mind, you lead by example, right? Every decision we make at any single day is contributing, right? So recycling, right? Or deciding that you're going to buy an EV, or considering your carbon footprint. And the reason you're riding 30 miles to go see the theater is because you don't want to drive or take a plane or something like that. So, I mean, it's all of those small decisions and those behaviors, I think, that are what contributes, right? And you never know. I mean, I have 3 small kids, right? And they watch what I do. And when I do that, I mean, my daughter recognized a recycling sign before she recognized the stop sign, right? I mean, it's the kind of ethos in which we're growing up and living in. So I would say that. The other thing, on a more personal note, I mean, I went into the energy sector because I wanted to improve lives. I was really interested in supporting the developing world and lifting lives there. And I saw the energy sector as a way to do that. You provide electricity and you help an economy grow. You provide electricity and you provide a light over a child that's trying to do their homework at night. right? And so in the end, between the economy and education, you're improving lives. Now I see it in an even broader context because I look at the existential threat of the 20th century being a nuclear holocaust, right? Basically blowing up the world several times over as a result of the Cold War. And I see, the existential threat that we're in the 21st century as climate change. And so it's within that context then that I think that it's excellent to go into and consider a career in the energy sector because it's even broader than when I entered it several years ago. And what is encouraging is that there's any range of roles and professions you can have, right? From designing more efficient buildings as an architect, as Jodi, or being an engineer, right, and working on other types of technology development, or working in policy, right, and developing the policies that we think will be most effective, recognizing that none of them are perfect, going back to everyone makes mistakes, to commercial, right, and that's kind of where my wheelhouse is. I'm thinking constantly of how can I help develop business models? How can I help identify the creation of markets so that we can get there in the most cost-effective way? So there are many different ways to come at it, but I think it's really an exciting industry to be in, and so that's what I would recommend those of you who are watching today.
I like that answer a lot, and like you even said earlier, New York's a leader in that transition to renewable energy. So an energy career, here at home would be great as well. Simeon, your thoughts on the action students can take?
Yeah. So just to wrap us up and kind of try to see if we can knit some of these pieces together. If we start with the premise that what we are ideally trying to build is a regenerative economy, if we recognize that we've got to put people at the center of that economy, that we've got to lift up those that have been historically excluded, that we have to look for the co-benefits, and that we've got to share equitably the co-burdens. If we've got to change our mental models, what I would leave you guys with is that you are in the point in your lives, and boy, I must confess that I miss it. I do, because I feel like I am often on a gerbil wheel, just kind of running. From one thing to the next. You're at a point in your life where you have some time for introspection. You're at a point in your life where you have some time for inquiry, where you have a chance to challenge the presumptions and some of the inculcations that you might have received, even in the educations that you might have received. I did a presentation a couple of months ago for some college students. And I said to this group of college students, I said, how many of you guys have heard of the Great Migration? And in a room full of 100, 150 people, 4 students raised their hand. And just for those that might not know, the Great Migration is the single largest movement of humanity in this country's history, with primarily former slaves and sharecroppers moving to northern cities in the industrialization of America, which, by the way, had environmental ramifications. And so when we think about that history, challenge those narratives. This is the time in your life that you get to do that. When you find that interesting, professor, spend a few extra minutes, work with each other and collaborate. And then also know that you have agency today to do something. You don't have to just wait until you're out of college and on your way, that your voice matters right now. And if there are ways that, particularly for those of you that are closer to my home, we're a place-based funder at the Rochester Area Community Foundation. If you're looking for folks to collaborate with and partner with, we certainly welcome and encourage it.
Great answer. And thank you all for answering my questions tonight. From now until approximately 7 o'clock, we have some audience questions coming in that I will be sharing. And then at 7 o'clock, participants will be moving into breakout rooms. So please stay for that. So Simeon, this might be a good one for you as well. Speaking about, including everybody in the conversation about climate change. This is a question from Vincent from RIT. He asks, how do we include everyone in the climate change conversation, including farmers, low-income communities, the homeless, and minorities?
Yeah, so I think the first step is to not talk about people in the abstract, but to talk about the actual people, right? To get to know the actual people that we're describing and talking about. One of the things I'm struck by is that when we start talking about lowering emissions as an example, I'm in a conversation right now with colleagues here in our community that are really trying to embrace air source heat pumps and geothermal and ground source heat pumps as a way to retrofit buildings, and particularly residential buildings, to reduce emissions. And hey, I tend to agree. I'm actually renovating a house for my family right now, and we've made the choice to do air source heat pumps. But we can do that because we've got some resources. It is expensive to do right now. So we can't start the conversation advocating a technology that is beyond the reach of the vast majority of people that are under-resourced in our community. We've got to start the conversation with how are we either going to bend that cost curve, how are we going to make these strategies work on behalf of people. And the best way to do that is to get out there and talk to them, right? To really embed yourself in the community. I sense that if we did a little bit more of that, our strategies would be more informed. And to Sarah's point, it's one of the things I do love about the fact that it is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And the community really does find its way in that legislation.
Yeah, I think it's really key first step to recognize that there are people other than yourself in the world. And I think that just talking to people, and I mean, they're already involved with climate change. It's just how do you involve them in the conversations you want to have about climate change? I think there's a difference there. And not just the conversations you want to have about climate change, but asking them what conversations need to be had about climate change. Because quite often, even in policy, we legislate from a position of privilege that doesn't resonate with how things actually become implemented. One example, just very quick, is even in home improvement kind of funding mechanisms, it's a really tough world when you're a contractor. And so contractors geared up to serve people who would be able to have access to the grant money, and they would do the weatherization work. They might not have been the best at the weatherization work. They might not have been the worst at the weatherization work. As soon as the grant money stopped, they stopped focusing on the communities that, that they were focusing on, and left those communities high and dry. Not blaming them, but the mechanism has to be aware of the actual implementation path and human nature in the process, not to legislate to the lowest common denominator, but to be clever in implementing in a way that helps people get excited and continue the process.
Great, Jodi, thanks for chiming in. Those are really insightful answers. And a question here coming in as well that I hope all of you can maybe answer. If you were able to add one thing to the CLCPA, what policy would you like to be enacted in New York? If you were to add one thing to that act.
I mean, I would just say that was a very comprehensive legislation to begin with. I think that it's very easy in some ways to pass law, but then the implementation of it is what's challenging, right? We have a lot of panels, the Climate Action Council. To me, it's really about, and I guess it goes back to what Jodi and Simeon were talking about, ensuring that you have the right stakeholders, all the right stakeholders at the table, so that we can figure out the most effective way, an inclusive way to implement the legislation that's been passed. That to me, because something written down is very different when it comes to being in the ground. And again, there's a minimum requirement of 30% of benefits to go to LMI or historically disadvantaged communities, articulating what that means, the metrics around that, so that it truly has the outcomes that we're seeking, I think is an area that needs to be focused. So I wouldn't necessarily add anything immediately, but maybe Jodi or Simeon have ideas.
Yeah, I'm actually staff on one of the panels that's working on some of the climate law, which is great. First of all, Clcpa is like the worst acronym ever. I just keep calling it the climate law. So that's what I mean when I say the climate law. One of the things that several of us have been working very hard to do is to introduce the concept of embodied carbon into the climate law work. The way the climate law is phrased and the way it has been approached at the start anyway, is to focus on operational carbon. So operational carbon is what it takes to run a building or run your vehicles. Embodied carbon is the amount of greenhouse gas investiture there is in a material or a product or a service. So in the building industry, which I represent, that's about 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions that will occur over the next 30 years in the building industry. So I think it's awesome that we're starting to have conversations about embodied carbon. I think that if there were one thing that I would like to add, it's a very clear direction on embodied carbon. And just to put it out to all of you, I think that's the next big awareness level. And the next big awareness level tied to that is the impact of nature on personal health and access to nature. So keep an eye on those two topics, embodied carbon and biophilia. And I think that will benefit your research going forward.
Yeah, I would add, at least as I understand the legislation, I think we're lagging behind some of the goals that have been set, and so we've already got some work that we've got to do. And then I was talking to some folks that are much more knowledgeable than I, even on the Clcpa. And one of the pieces of legislation that I understand is being advanced now in the state legislature is the CCIA, which is the Climate and Community Investment Act, which basically says that it's one thing to pass the law, but we also need the dollars to make sure it actually gets done. And we've got to, as a state, put our money where our mouth is. And so what the bill, as I understand it, basically says is that if you're a corporate polluter, then what we want to do is figure out a way to extract some of the dollars there so that we can use it to regenerate our economy. And I tend to think that, at least as I understand the legislation, that's a good idea. I will share one just really quick story. And this came up in a meeting I was in a couple of weeks ago. And I remember reading this article. It was in the Chicago Tribune a few years back. And it uses a derogatory term, the crying Indian ad. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? That ad is the title of this article basically suggests that at the time that there were massive lawsuits, particularly against some of the folks in the beverage industry and a few others, instead of kind of taking their lumps and making the changes that were necessary, they came together and they supported money for this ad that just took America by storm. That featured a gentleman with First Peoples origin kind of walking through and seeing pollution, and he has that one tear that dramatically drops from his face, and in so doing distracts from the corporate responsibility and places the onus largely on individuals for our behavioral choices. Now listen, I'm not shorting behavioral choices. We do need to make good choices, no doubt about that. But it's also the case that many of the systems that are in place are not friendly to the kinds of policies that we want to have. And it seems to me that that's where we can lean in. I think the CCIA helps us to start to do that and strengthens the Clcpa.
Very cool. I haven't heard of that policy before, so I'll definitely investigate that a little bit as well. Very interesting. Another question, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about making those solar panels more efficient and kind of localizing that energy. And maybe this is a good question for Sarah here. Is New York exploring a shift away from a large statewide electrical grid to smaller self-contained power systems to maybe increase resiliency?
Yes. I mean, I think that's where the grid's going, right? We talk about prosumers, we talk about an orchestrated and distributed energy grid. So I think that there's not an either or, but and, right? So supporting the fact that we have grid scale renewables in the North Country, in the Southern tier, and that the majority of our load or demand is in the Southeast, right? That having effective transport of that through transmission is helpful. But at the same time, NYPA is working with all of our customers across the state to install distributed energy resources, solar plus storage. Some of the kind of marquee projects are also in in Manhattan, specifically the largest solar rooftop canopy on the green roof at the Javits Center, the largest community distributed generation facility at JFK, where half of the megawatts are going to support JFK and the airport's use, and the other 5 megawatts are going specifically to the community in that area. So yes, it's both, right? And not either or. So yes, I guess that's a short answer.
That's great, and that's an opportunity too to start to think. Well, as an architect, I get frustrated because I learned that you design the building to 5 feet outside the building walls. We can't do that anymore. We have to start to pay attention to where the energy comes from, and we need to start designing with community and synergies in mind. And if we can get a community to invest in a community sourced renewable energy system, that's phenomenal. Not only does that start to create the resilience in the system and diversify the power system, it also starts to build community and reinforce our reliance on each other, our interdependence. Interdependence is a sign of true strength. It's not a weakness. It's the evolved circumstance. After you become independent, you start to be confident enough to be interdependent with people. And so that's where we need to go now.
I will just add to that. I'll tell you, I've had this bug in my craw, and this is kind of more germane to the nonprofit sector that I work in, but there's this language that I always hear about self-sufficiency. And it's such a myth. Who's self-sufficient? What does that even mean? Of course, we're interdependent on one another, that we interact with each other. That's literally what it means to be in society. But one of the interesting kind of zeitgeist, if you will, of the moment, that I see at least, and you see it in a lot of different areas, in music and cryptocurrency and so many different areas, is these ideas of distributed nodes. And so it seems to me that it makes sense that in energy generation and power generation, we would follow the same pattern, that those distributed nodes allow for communities to think about smart ways to be interdependent, to leverage resources with one another. And I'll just use that, particularly that word leverage is an interesting one, because anybody that knows about a lever knows that it operates on a fulcrum. And the closer that fulcrum gets to the thing that you're trying to lift, the less pressure you have to put on to lift it. So my thinking is, let's get the fulcrum as close as we can to the people that are in our communities, that are in our neighborhoods, so that it's a lot less of a lift, so that we can make the kinds of change that I think all of us hope to achieve.
That's a great representation. I'm going to use that. With your permission.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And you were asking, like, what's the one most important thing? It's attending things like this, where your fellow panelists are more inspirational than anybody else you've talked to today. So thank you, Jodi and Simeon. I need to get invited to more panels with college students. I got to get off the industry circuit.
Well, I'm sure it's benefited all the students here. So I know it's benefited me. So really enjoyed this. And again, thank you all for coming and participating on this panel. I learned a lot. Some of my key takeaways: rethinking our consumption mentality. That's something I've been thinking a lot about, thinking about, do I really need to buy some of those things that I've been buying? How can I always reduce what I'm purchasing? Also, Jodi, your point, that continuous learning mentality, that's something that I've really started to develop with, a growth mindset. And I think that's really, really crucial for everybody. And then also your point about, if we can't respect nature, we won't even be able to solve the climate crisis. That was great as well. Simeon, you talked about, being in balance, being in harmony, and working together and bringing everybody up to be successful. I really like those points. And of course, creating a regenerative economy instead of this extractive economy. So great points all around. I had a fun time. I hope you guys did. At 7 o'clock, we're going to start the breakout rooms on different sustainability topics. For registrants of the event, we tried to match you as best as we could with your first choice. For those that did not register and just received the Zoom link, you can self-select your breakout room. So no issues there. Again, thank you. I enjoyed this. I hope you all did too. Thanks for coming.
Just a quick note before I open the breakout rooms for everyone to self-select, besides the people that I've already assigned. Please try to keep the numbers in these breakout rooms relatively even. We already have a lot of people in climate justice, environmental justice. Just try to keep them even when you're looking at the when you're going to join. Thank you.
Also, I guess I should add, we're going to come back at around 7:50 and kind of close up the whole event. So see you at 7:50. Perfect. So now we're going to do an activity on this website called Mentimeter, and we're going to create a word cloud of all the different actions that you all discussed in your breakout rooms. And we can kind of see like the most popular ones and display that on the screen here as well. Yeah, so mentimeter.com, and then use the code up here at the top of the screen, 40967384. And once you all submit some of those actions, we'll be able to see them on the screen here. And usually the larger ones displayed are the most popular words. And try to keep it 1 to 2 words maximum. Ripple effect, interesting. Educate, important, of course. Many of us are students, so hopefully reading that education. Education, educate, popular ones. Communicating and listening, I like those a lot too. Education, a stronghold here for the actions. I think I saw eat less meat. That's definitely something I've also been thinking about a lot recently too. Awesome. We'll give it a few more moments here just to see if education keeps that #1 spot. All right. Great answers. I like all of them. Vote. important as well. Coalition building, student engagement. I like all these a lot. Well, everybody, I had a great time tonight. I learned a lot myself. I hope you were able to take away a lot as well from the panelists. Make sure to mark your calendars for next year, March 30th, 2022. We're going to do it all again and talk climate, talk how we can solve climate. I'm sure Dr. Goodstein has some great plans in the workings. I heard him talking about it in a breakout room earlier. And thank you all for joining. Thank you to the panelists for coming on, of course, and the facilitators for working those breakout rooms and making those go smoothly as well. As far as faculty goes, plan on keeping, making climate change a class and including climate education, whenever you can implement it into your classroom. That would be great. Thank you all again, and have a nice night.